Get this fat cow out to my sight before I lose my appetite." Dominic Russo seized Hazel's wrist, mid-pour twisting, until the coffee pot shook in her grip, his ring cutting into her skin, and hurled her sideways into the serving cart with enough force that every glass on it shattered against the marble floor. The entire table of Chicago's most dangerous men went completely silent, then erupted in laughter. Hazel knelt on that cold floor, bleeding from her palm, picking up every shard of broken glass while Russo stepped deliberately over her hand. Nobody flinched, nobody moved. But one man at the head of that table stopped laughing entirely. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Hazel Jenkins had worked the underground dining room of Castello Nero for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew this, not because she kept a journal or counted milestones. She knew it because every single shift felt exactly the same. She would arrive through the service entrance on Wacker Drive at 5:45 in the evening. She would change into the black uniform that was always a size too small in the shoulders and always a size too large in the waist, because whoever ordered the staff uniforms had never once actually looked at her. She would pin her name tag to the left side of her chest, the little brass rectangle that said Hazel in capital letters, and then she would spend the next 6 hours being completely and utterly invisible. That was not a complaint, that was a survival strategy. Castello Nero was not a normal restaurant. It sat beneath a luxury hotel in the heart of downtown Chicago, accessible only through a private elevator that required a key card or through the kitchen service corridor that smelled permanently of garlic and bleach. The dining room itself was all dark wood and low amber lighting, heavy curtains on walls that had no windows, and tables spaced so far apart that a whispered conversation at one could never be heard at another. The acoustics were intentional. Everything about Castello Nero was intentional. The men who ate here were not businessmen. They were not politicians. They were not old money families celebrating anniversaries over Barolo and truffle risotto. They were the kind of men whose names appeared in federal case files under categories that required special clearance to access. They were the kind of men who settled disagreements not in courtrooms, but in the moments after dessert was cleared and the staff had been sent to the back. They were the kind of men who paid for their meals in cash, tipped extravagantly, and never not once looked a single member of the waitstaff in the eye. Hazel had learned this on her first shift. She had made the mistake of making direct eye contact with a man at table 4 while pouring his water. And the floor manager, a thin, nervous Italian man named Caruso, had grabbed her by the elbow in the hallway afterward and whispered through clenched teeth, "You look at the glass. You look at the table. You look at the floor. You do not look at the faces. Do you understand me?" She had nodded. She had understood perfectly. And from that night forward, she had become exactly what this room needed her to be: a ghost in black polyester, a pair of hands that appeared with food and disappeared without a sound. The other waitstaff, mostly young men in their 20s, who were working their way through culinary school or paying off debts, they hated working the underground room. They found the silence oppressive. They found the men terrifying. They requested transfers constantly, and Caruso constantly denied them because warm bodies that showed up on time and kept their mouths shut were hard to find. But Hazel never requested a transfer. The pay was 3 times what she would make at any restaurant above ground. The tips were extraordinary. And the silence, the terrifying, suffocating silence that the other servers found unbearable, Hazel found clarifying. In silence, you could hear everything. She had learned over 3 years and 2 months and 11 days that the men at these tables operated on a kind of coded language that most people would miss entirely. A compliment delivered with a slight pause before the subject's name was not a compliment. A handshake that lasted 2 seconds longer than a normal handshake meant an agreement had been finalized. A man who touched his tie 3 times during a conversation was lying. A man who leaned back in his chair while another man was speaking was not relaxed. He was making a point about who had more power in the room. Hazel understood all of it. Not because she was trained in intelligence or body language or criminal psychology. She understood it because she had spent her entire life in rooms where she wasn't supposed to be paying attention. As a girl growing up in a 3-bedroom apartment on the South Side with 4 siblings and a mother who worked double shifts and a father who came and went like weather, Hazel had learned that the quietest person in the room was always the one who understood the room the best. Being overlooked had never been an accident for Hazel. It had been a skill she cultivated, a shield she wore, and in this particular underground dining room in the heart of Chicago, it was the only reason she was still alive. Tonight, though, tonight was different. She felt it the moment she stepped off the service elevator at 5:58, 2 minutes before her shift technically began, because Caruso had called her personally at 3 in the afternoon and told her not to be late. Caruso never called personally. Caruso communicated through a group text chain and passive-aggressive notes left on the staff bulletin board. A personal phone call from Caruso meant something had elevated above his normal level of operational anxiety. The kitchen was louder than usual. Not chaotic, the kitchen was never chaotic. Chef Marco ran it like a military operation, but there was a particular kind of controlled intensity in the air, the kind that meant every single person in this building knew that tonight's reservation was significant, in a way that went beyond normal significant. She grabbed her order pad from the hook near the service window. The young server named Darius, 22 years old criminology student at DePaul, fell into step beside her as they moved toward the dining room. "You know who's coming tonight," he whispered. "Don't ask me things like that," she said quietly. "It's Vitiello," Darius said, anyway, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear him over the sound of the ventilation system. "Alessandro Vitiello. They just confirmed the reservation 20 minutes ago. That's why Caruso's been walking in circles for the last hour." Hazel did not react. She kept walking. But something inside her chest did a slow, measured thing that was not quite fear and not quite recognition. It was something older than both of those feelings. Alessandro Vitiello. She had heard that name before. Everyone in Chicago had heard that name before, even people who had no reason to be connected to anything that name was connected to. It appeared in the Tribune occasionally, always in carefully worded articles that never quite said what they meant. It appeared in conversations in barbershops and corner stores on the North Side, always with a particular kind of careful respect, the kind of respect that people extended to things they understood could hurt them. It appeared in the memory she kept in a very specific, very locked drawer in the back of her mind, a memory from 6 years ago, a different restaurant, a different city. A moment when a stranger had done something for her that no one had asked him to do, and nothing had required him to do, and she had never seen him again. She had never been entirely sure if that stranger and the Alessandro Vitiello of Tribune articles and corner store conversations were the same person. She was about to find out. The dining room was already half full when she entered. The regulars were at their usual tables, the 3 men from the Petrov organization, who always sat near the east wall. The 2 lawyers whose names she had never learned, but whose faces she would have recognized in a police lineup without hesitation, and at the long table near the back, the old guard. The men who had run Chicago's underground economy for the better part of 3 decades, who were currently in the process of something that Hazel did not have a precise word for, but that she recognized as the kind of transition that happened when power changed hands, and not everyone agreed about how the changing was supposed to work. Dominic Russo was already seated. He was a large man, 70 years old, but carrying himself like he believed the number was negotiable. His face was the color of old brick, permanently flushed from decades of expensive whiskey, and his hands, she noticed his hands every time she served him, because they were the hands of a man who had used them for things she did not let herself think about too specifically. His hands were always restless, tapping, adjusting, moving silverware a 1/4 inch to the left and then a 1/4 inch back to the right. Tonight, his hands were completely still. That was new. She moved to table 7, where 2 men in their 40s were finishing appetizers, and she began clearing the small plates with practiced efficiency. Her movements were economical and silent. She was aware of the room the way a naturalist is aware of an ecosystem, not through focused observation, but through a kind of ambient absorption that happened without effort. The elevator opened. The room did not go quiet. The room was already quiet. but there was a quality shift in the silence, the way the air in a building changes when a window is opened somewhere you cannot see, and Hazel felt it in her shoulders before she consciously processed it. Alessandro Vitiello walked into the Castello Nero dining room at 6:17 in the evening, and he walked in the way that men who do not need to announce themselves walk, at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberately slow, accompanied by two men whose function was obvious and who positioned themselves without instruction in a way that suggested the positioning had been considered long before they arrived. Hazel did not look up from clearing table 7. She was aware of him in the way she was aware of everything in this room, peripherally completely cataloging without appearing to catalog. He was taller than she had expected. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of clothes that were expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. He moved to the head of the long back table, the way water finds the lowest point, not aggressively, simply inevitably, as if the chair at the head of the table had always been waiting for exactly him. Russo stood to greet him. Hazel watched in her peripheral vision the handshake. It lasted 2.5 seconds. She moved toward the service corridor. "Jenkins." Caruso materialized at her elbow like a nervous apparition. "Table 1 through 6 are yours tonight. Stay in rotation. Do not linger. Do not make eye contact. And for the love of God, do not spill anything." "When have I ever spilled anything?" she said, not quite a question. Caruso opened his mouth, closed it, and walked away. The next 90 minutes proceeded in the way that the best service always proceeded, invisibly. She moved through the room in her established patterns, delivering bread, removing plates, refilling water glasses to exactly 3/4 full, without being asked anticipating needs before they were expressed. The kitchen sent out courses in precise intervals. Chef Marco's timing was, as always, perfect. At the long back table, the conversation between Alessandro Vitiello and Dominic Russo and the 7 other men arranged around them was conducted in the low measured tones that Hazel had learned to read like music. She caught fragments as she moved through the room. Not words, she was never close enough to catch words directly, and the table acoustics were designed to prevent exactly that. But she caught the rhythms, the patterns, the silences that meant more than the speech. Russo was doing most of the talking. This was normal for Russo. Russo had the personality of a man who equated volume with authority. But tonight there was something different about the quality of his talking. It had a particular kind of smoothness, an oiled, practiced quality, like a machine that had been calibrated specifically for tonight's function. Alessandro listened in a way that looked like patience, but was actually something more precise. His face gave away very little. His hands, she noticed when she was close enough to notice, rested on the table in a way that was completely, unnaturally still. The only time he moved was to lift his water glass or to make a small, economical gesture with 2 fingers that seemed to either confirm or redirect whatever point was being made. At 8:45, she was carrying a tray of empty plates to the kitchen when she passed through the narrow corridor behind the bar, and she saw something. She almost didn't register it. Later, she would think about this, how close she came to simply walking past, how easily it could have happened, how the trajectory of 3 lives, maybe more, turned on a moment of accidental peripheral attention. The bartender's name was Vincent. He had worked Castello Nero for 5 years longer than her. He was 35, quiet, competent, the kind of bartender who remembered what every regular drank and had it ready before they sat down. She had always respected him in the abstract, professional way she respected anyone who did their job well without making a show of it. Vincent was standing at the far end of the bar, back 3/4 turned to the room, and a man she recognized as one of Russo's. She knew him only by the name Marco Rosso, which was almost certainly not his real name. A compact man with a forgettable face, who attended every dinner where Russo attended, was leaning against the bar in a posture that was trying very hard to look casual. Something passed between them, small, quick, the movement of 2 hands that had practiced this exchange enough times to make it look like nothing. A fold of a cocktail napkin transferred from one palm to another. Hazel kept walking. She did not break stride. She turned into the kitchen, set her tray down, and stood at the dish station for 11 seconds, breathing through her nose. She had just seen a man hand a bartender something small enough to fit inside a folded napkin. She turned back around and walked out through the same corridor. Vincent was behind the bar now in his normal position, the napkin gone. On the bar in front of him were 3 crystal glasses, the heavy, wide-bottomed kind that Castello Nero used exclusively for their top-shelf whiskeys. He was pouring, the Macallan 18. She recognized the bottle. It came out only for specific toasts at specific moments, and she knew that tonight's dinner was structured around one such moment, a toast that Caruso had briefed them about in the pre-service meeting, a formal acknowledgement of a new agreement between the assembled parties. 3 glasses. She counted them automatically the way she counted everything. Vincent poured the first glass, then the second, then the third. And then with a movement so practiced and so small that she would have missed it if she had not already been watching his hands with particular attention. He reached beneath the bar for a fraction of a second, and when his hand came back up, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible moment before he picked up the third glass. 1 glass. He picked up one specific glass and set it fractionally apart from the others on the bar. Hazel understood what she had seen. She stood very still. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive and employed and functional for 28 years by making excellent pragmatic decisions about which situations to involve herself in and which to walk away from, began speaking very clearly and very quickly. You did not see that. You saw a bartender preparing drinks. You saw a man lean against a bar. You are in a room full of the most dangerous people in this city. You are a waitress. You are nobody here. You are invisible. You walk away. You go to the back. You do your job. You go home. She stood in the corridor for 4 seconds that felt like 4 hours. And then she thought about something she had not thought about in a very long time. She thought about Memphis. She had been 22 years old working a banquet at a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, her 3rd city in 2 years, as she moved from service job to service job, trying to build enough savings to eventually get back to Chicago, where her family was, and where she had always, at some level, understood her life was going to have to eventually return to. She had been carrying a tray of champagne glasses through a crowded reception, and a group of men drunk entitled, "The specific combination that produced the specific kind of casual cruelty that people with power think they're entitled to," had decided that she was an appropriate target for a series of comments that started rude and escalated rapidly. She had been standing there, tray in both hands, unable to walk away because of the configuration of the crowd, when a man standing nearby, a man who was not part of the group, who had no obvious stake in the situation, who had nothing to gain and technically something to lose, had turned to the group and said with the very specific quiet of someone who does not need volume because they know they will be heard, "That's enough." Just those 2 words. But the way he said them, the way the men stopped, the way the air changed, she had never been able to describe it properly to anyone she'd tried to describe it to. The closest she'd gotten was, it was the first time in her adult life that she had stood in a room and felt for a moment like she was a person rather than an object, because someone had made a choice to see her. She had not seen his face clearly. The room was crowded, and by the time she had composed herself enough to look, he had already moved away. She had caught a glimpse. Dark suit, dark hair, a way of holding himself that she had never quite forgotten. She stood in the service corridor of Castello Nero at 8:47 in the evening, and she made a decision. A terrible decision. A dangerous decision. The kind of decision that the pragmatic, practical, survival-oriented part of her brain was screaming was the single worst possible thing she could do in this situation. She picked up a silver tray from the service station. She walked to the bar. "I'll take those," she said to Vincent. He looked at her. Just for a second, a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that she catalogued and filed. Then his expression returned to its normal professional blankness, and he said, "Those are for table 1. Caruso said, "Caruso reassigned table 1 to me," she said. Her voice was absolutely steady. She was very proud of it in that moment. "He told me 5 minutes ago." Vincent looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. She looked back at him, not at the glasses, not at the bar, at his face directly the way Caruso had told her never to look at anyone in this room. Vincent placed the 3 glasses on her tray. She could not tell from the way they looked which one was different. She could not smell anything unusual. She had no way of knowing, standing at this bar with this tray in her hands, if she had interpreted what she'd seen correctly, if her judgment was right, if the most elaborate and terrible assumption she had ever made in her life was accurate. She was operating entirely on pattern recognition and instinct, and a 6-year-old memory of 2 words spoken by a stranger in a Memphis hotel. She turned away from the bar and walked toward the long back table. Her hands were completely steady. This was the thing people who had never carried a tray through a dangerous situation did not understand. Your hands went steady when the fear became large enough. It was not the absence of fear. It was fear at a volume so extreme that the body stopped registering it as something to respond to physically and simply rerouted all available resources to the task at hand. She walked through the dining room. She was aware of the positions of every person in the room. The 2 men at Alessandro's flanks. The 4 men spread around the perimeter of the space Russo's people positioned with the specific casualness of men who had been placed rather than who had chosen their spots. Darius near the kitchen entrance, unaware. Caruso somewhere behind her. She reached the long table. Up close, Alessandro Vitiello was exactly what he appeared from across the room, contained precise, generating a specific gravity that the air around him organized itself around. Russo to his right was speaking. Something about the future. Something about partnership. The language of men who were not saying what they meant. Hazel set the first glass in front of the man to Alessandro's left, the second in front of the man to his right. She was holding the third glass on the tray. And then Russo's elbow moved a wide gesture accompanying whatever point he was making, and the gesture brought him momentarily slightly off balance, and Hazel moved. Not a fall. Not a stumble, a precise, calibrated shift of her weight that translated through the tray into an absolutely convincing stumble 3 degrees off center, enough to create disruption, enough to require recovery, enough to occupy every eye in the immediate vicinity for exactly 1.5 seconds. In that 1.5 seconds, her right hand moved the third glass from one position on the tray to another. She set it in front of Russo. She set the clean glass in front of Alessandro. "My apologies," she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had just nearly stumbled, appropriately embarrassed, appropriately flustered, utterly unremarkable. "I'm so sorry. Can I get anyone anything else?" Nobody answered her. Nobody looked at her. She began to turn away. And then she felt it. Not a touch. Not a word. Just the particular quality of attention, the specific, focused, absolutely complete quality of attention that happens when someone who has been watching everything has found the one thing in the room worth watching. She did not look back. She walked toward the service corridor and she breathed, and she did not look back, and she was absolutely certain with every nerve in her body that Alessandro Vitiello was watching her walk away. From across the room, Darius appeared at her elbow. "You okay? You almost dropped—" "I'm fine," she said. "You sure you look—" "Darius?" She stopped walking. She turned to look at him with the full, steady weight of her gaze. "I'm fine. Go check on table 3. He went to table 3. She stood at the entrance to the service corridor, and she listened to the sound of men's voices from the back table, low and formal and smooth, and she listened to her own heartbeat, which was moving at a speed that she was working very hard to pretend was not affecting her, and she waited. The toast was coming. She could feel it in the rhythm of the room, the way a musician can feel a resolution coming before the chord is played. She waited. And then Russo's voice, slightly louder than the rest, with the particular performance quality of a man who is accustomed to holding the room, "Gentlemen, to new agreements and to the future." The sound of crystal being lifted, the sound of crystal meeting crystal, the sound of men drinking. And then silence. And then from the back of the room where Dominic Russo had been sitting 60 seconds ago, a sound that was unlike any sound that had been made in the Castello Nero dining room in all the time Hazel Jenkins had worked there. A chair scraping back violently, a glass hitting the floor, and a man's body following it. The body hit the floor at 9:14 in the evening. Hazel heard it from the service corridor. Not the fall itself, the sound that came after the fall. The particular quality of silence that follows something irreversible. The kind of silence that has weight and texture, and that every person in a room feels simultaneously in the chest before the brain has finished processing what the ears just registered. Then the chaos began. It started with a single voice, one of Russo's men positioned near the east wall, a compact man named Ferretti, whose job in the room had been to watch exits, and that voice said one word sharply, and the word was a name, and the name was Russo, and the way he said it told Hazel everything she needed to know about whether what she had done had worked. She pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her palm, still lightly cut from the earlier confrontation, was pressed flat against the cold surface behind her. She focused on that pressure, the physical sensation of something real and solid at her back. In the dining room, the silence broke all at once. Chairs scraped, men's voices collided. She heard Caruso somewhere, his particular high-stressed pitch cutting through everything else, saying something about a doctor, about calling someone, and then being immediately overridden by a voice she did not recognize telling him with absolute finality to put the phone down. She breathed, in, out. In, out. Darius appeared at the other end of the corridor, his face the color of old paper. He was 22 years old and studying criminology at DePaul University, and he had probably read about situations like this in textbooks, and now he was living inside one, and his body did not know what to do with the distance between those two things. His mouth opened. Hazel shook her head once sharply. He closed his mouth. She pointed toward the far end of the corridor, away from the dining room. Darius looked at her, looked at the direction she was pointing, looked back at her. She pointed again more firmly. He went. She stayed. She stayed because leaving felt wrong in a way she could not have articulated precisely, but that she trusted completely. She had spent 3 years developing a specific, finely calibrated instinct for this room, and that instinct was telling her that walking away right now in the next 60 seconds would be the single most dangerous thing she could do. Invisible people don't run. Running makes you visible. From the dining room, she heard the voice she had been listening for without knowing she was listening for it. Alessandro Vitiello's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the specific quality of a sound that a room organizes itself around, not because the sound is aggressive, but because it carries the particular authority of someone who has never once in their life needed to repeat themselves. Everyone sit down. 2 seconds of resistant shuffling. I said sit down. The shuffling stopped. Ferretti, check his pulse. Do it now, not in 5 seconds. Now. The sound of a man moving quickly across the room. A pause. Then Ferretti's voice lower, and Hazel had to strain to hear it. He's gone, boss. A silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Caruso. Alessandro's voice unchanged in quality, unchanged in temperature. Lock the front entrance. Nobody leaves this building until I say so. Hazel heard Caruso's footsteps, the rapid, clicking, anxious footsteps of a man who was terrified, but more terrified of disobeying than of anything else crossing the dining room toward the elevator. Her heart was hitting her sternum in a rhythm that had nothing to do with rest. She understood with complete and total clarity what had just happened and what was about to happen. Dominic Russo was dead on the floor of the Castello Nero dining room. Alessandro Vitiello was about to conduct what amounted to a private investigation inside a locked underground restaurant. Every person in the building was about to be examined with a level of scrutiny that Hazel Jenkins, standing in a service corridor with the knowledge of what she had done sitting inside her chest like a lit match, was singularly unqualified to survive. Unless she was exactly what she had always been in this room. Nobody. She straightened her posture. She smoothed the front of her uniform. She picked up an empty tray from the service station beside her. Her hands found it automatically, her body defaulting to the muscle memory of 3 years of shifts, and she walked back into the dining room. The scene she walked into had the frozen, strange quality of a photograph. 8 men remaining at the long back table, most of them standing, 2 of them still seated, with the particular rigidity of men who have been trained to show nothing. Russo's body was on the floor beside his chair, the overturned glass beside him, the spilled Macallan spreading dark across the white tablecloth that had fallen with him. Ferretti was crouched near the body. 2 of Alessandro's men had moved to positions near the perimeter of the room that were not accidental, and Alessandro Vitiello was standing at the head of the table, and he was looking directly at Hazel, Not at the body, not at his men, not at the room, at her. She did not stop walking. She moved to the nearest unoccupied table and began clearing glasses with the steady automatic efficiency that had taken her 3 years to develop the efficiency of someone who has learned to make their movements look like they require no thought, because thought draws attention, and attention is dangerous. She cleared 2 glasses. Stop. She stopped. The room heard the word and went very still. Hazel set the glasses down carefully on her tray and looked up, because not looking up when Alessandro Vitiello said, "Stop" would itself be a kind of decision. He was still looking at her, up close in the full weight of his direct attention, rather than the peripheral awareness she had been managing all evening. Alessandro Vitiello was something she had not fully anticipated, not the coldness she had expected. The coldness, the reputation had prepared her for the coldness. What she had not expected was the precision. The quality of his attention was not aggressive. It was surgical. It was the attention of someone who was not looking at the surface of a thing, but through it. And what she felt under that attention was the specific disorienting sensation of being actually seen by someone for the first time in 3 years, of being invisible in this room. "Come here," he said. She came. She walked to within 4 feet of him and stopped. Up close, she could see that his glass, the glass she had placed in front of him, was still more than half full. He had not drunk much. She filed this information in the part of her mind that filed everything automatically without deciding to. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Around them, the room held its breath. "What's your name?" he said. "Hazel?" she said. "Hazel Jenkins." "How long have you worked here, Hazel Jenkins?" 3 years, she said. 2 months. Something moved in his expression. Not much. Enough. 3 years, he repeated very quietly, as if the number meant something specific to him that it did not mean to anyone else in the room. "Yes, sir." Another silence. Then, "Where were you when Mr. Russo collapsed?" "The service corridor," she said. "I had just returned from delivering the drinks to this table." "Delivered by you." "Delivered by me." He held her gaze for exactly 5 seconds. She counted them. 5 seconds of being looked at by Alessandro Vitiello with the full, unfiltered weight of whatever was happening behind those eyes was approximately 5 seconds more than most people in this room had ever been able to sustain, and she held it because she had spent 28 years learning how to hold things. Then he said, "Ferretti." Ferretti straightened from his crouch beside the body and came to Alessandro's side. He was compact, dark-eyed, 40 years old, and he looked at Hazel the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't categorized yet. "The bartender," Alessandro said. "Vincent, bring him." Ferretti went to the bar. Hazel did not react. She kept her eyes on Alessandro's face, kept her expression at the specific level of calm that a professional in a service role maintains when a situation around them is abnormal, but their job requires them to remain functional. Vincent came from behind the bar with Ferretti's hand on his shoulder, not gripping, not violent, but communicating clearly. He stopped 6 feet from where Hazel stood. She did not look at him directly. She was aware of him the way she was aware of everything. Alessandro looked between them. "The Macallan," he said. "Who poured it?" "I did," Vincent said. His voice was steady. He was good. He had practiced this or something like it. "Standard pour, same bottle we use for—" "Who told you to use that bottle tonight?" A pause. 1 second, which was 1 second too long. "Mr. Caruso always selects the bottle for formal—" "That's not what I asked you." Vincent's jaw tightened. "Mr. Russo's office called this afternoon. Special request for the Macallan 18 for the toast." The room absorbed this information. Hazel absorbed it. Alessandro let it sit in the air for a moment, the way a man lets something sit when he already knew it, and is now simply establishing that everyone else knows it too. "Russo's office," Alessandro said. "Yes." "Russo requested the specific bottle for the toast." "Yes." Alessandro nodded slowly. Just once, the nod of a man who has just confirmed the final piece of something he had already assembled. Then he turned to look at Hazel again, and this time the quality of his look was different, still precise, still surgical. But now there was something else in it, something that Hazel did not have a word for, yet something that sat between recognition and question. "You were at the bar earlier," he said, not a question. "I collected the glasses from the bar," she said. "You collected them yourself, not standard rotation." "No," she agreed. "Why?" This was the moment. She had been moving toward this moment since she had watched Vincent's hand come up from behind the bar with that fractional pause, and she had been preparing for it without knowing she was preparing for it, and now it was here, and everything that happened next depended entirely on what she said in the next 5 seconds. She said, "Because I saw something that told me the standard rotation wasn't appropriate tonight." The room went to a different level of still. Alessandro Vitiello's face did not change, not 1 degree, but something behind his eyes shifted the way ice shifts on a lake in early spring, subtle and structural, and indicating something much larger moving beneath. "What did you see?" he said. "A transfer," she said, "at the bar, between the bartender and a man I recognized as one of Mr. Russo's associates. Something small, inside a napkin, and then a specific glass was placed apart from the others." The silence that followed this was different from all the previous silences. This one had direction. It was moving towards something. Ferretti's hand was no longer resting on Vincent's shoulder. It had changed position in a way that made the change in everything else very clear. Vincent's composure, which had been genuinely impressive, broke. Not all at once, it fractured the way expensive things fracture along internal lines that had always been there. His chin moved slightly. His eyes moved to the floor. And then with the particular collapse of a man who has just realized that the architecture of his plan has failed, and that the person who was supposed to be dead is standing 4 feet away, looking at him, he said, "I want a lawyer." Alessandro looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "That's not a conversation that happens in this room." 2 of Alessandro's men moved from the perimeter. Vincent was escorted out through the service corridor, without another word, without a sound, with a speed and efficiency that spoke to extensive practice. The door to the corridor closed. The room returned to its configuration of men in expensive suits, sitting very still in chairs and trying to occupy as little space as possible. Hazel stood where she had been standing. Alessandro turned back to her. And this was the moment she had not prepared for, because she had prepared for accusation, for suspicion, for the possibility that what she had done would be interpreted as interference rather than intervention. She had prepared for the cold efficiency of a powerful man who could make problems disappear and who might reasonably classify her as a problem. She had prepared for many versions of what happened in this room after Alessandro Vitiello understood what she had done. She had not prepared for the look on his face. It was not gratitude, not precisely. It was something more complicated than gratitude, something that moved through several different emotions in quick succession before settling on a kind of profound, exhausted recognition. The look of a man who has spent a very long time expecting the world to contain a particular kind of person and has just unexpectedly found one. "Memphis," he said. 1 word. Her breath stopped. "The Langford Hotel," he said. "You were carrying a tray of champagne 6 years ago." The locked drawer in the back of her mind came open. She said nothing. Her body had stopped producing the ability to say anything. "You didn't see my face clearly," he said. "It was not a question." "But I saw yours." The room was listening. She understood that the room was listening, and that this conversation was happening in front of people for whom its contents were irrelevant, and for whom the dynamic it was establishing was anything but. She understood all of this, and she could not make herself care about any of it, because Alessandro Vitiello was standing in front of her, telling her that he remembered Memphis, and the thing she had carried in a locked drawer for 6 years, the uncertainty about whether that moment had been real, whether the man had been real, whether anyone had actually seen her, or whether she had imagined it, the way lonely people sometimes imagined being seen, was resolved. It had been real. He had been real. And he had remembered. "You changed the glass," he said. Quiet. Completely quiet. Just between them, though, it was not just between them, and both of them knew it. "You saw what was going to happen, and you changed the glass." She found her voice somewhere. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him. She thought about giving him a practical answer. She had several available. They would have been accurate. They would have been reasonable. They would have been the kind of answer that a professional gives when they need to explain an action that went beyond their job description. Instead, she told him the truth. "Because you said enough," she said. "In Memphis. You said enough, and you walked away, and I never forgot it." The dining room of Castello Nero Underground, Chicago, 9:31 in the evening, was completely and absolutely silent. Alessandro Vitiello looked at Hazel Jenkins for a long time, long enough that Ferretti, returning from wherever he had been, stopped in the doorway of the service corridor and assessed the room and made a decision to stay where he was without being told. Then Alessandro did something she had not seen him do once in the entire evening. He sat down, not at the head of the long table, at the nearest chair. Sat down the way a man sits when something has happened inside him that requires a moment of physical adjustment, and he rested both forearms on the table, and he looked down at his hands, and then he looked back up at her. "Sit down, Hazel Jenkins," he said. Around the table, every remaining man shifted the instinctive, uncomfortable shifting of men who are watching something they do not have a category for. She sat. Not across from him, the chair was to his left. Not the power position, not a position that made any kind of statement. She simply sat tray still in her hands, uniform slightly crooked from the evening's various stresses, palms still carrying the thin memory of broken glass. He looked at the tray. "You can put that down." She put it on the table. Ferretti had moved into the room now and was standing to Alessandro's right, and the other men at the table had resolved their discomfort into a watchful, cautious attention that recognized that something significant was being established without being able to name precisely what. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Alessandro said. "From the beginning, everything." So she told him. She told him about the corridor behind the bar, the napkin, the specific positioning of Vincent's hands, the glass set fractionally apart. She told it clearly chronologically without embellishment, the way she had always processed information with the economy of someone who had learned early that adding extra words to things often caused people to believe you less rather than more. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly. He listened the way she had watched him listen all evening, with the complete, focused architectural attention of someone who was not just hearing words, but building something from them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The glass you switched it to. Where did it come from?" "Clean stock," she said. "I picked it up from the service station on the way to the table. I replaced it on the tray before I delivered." "And the original glass, the one you removed. Where is it?" She paused. This was the part she had not figured out. She had managed the exchange at the table with surgical precision, but she had been operating on adrenaline and instinct, and she had not fully thought through what came after. The glass, the original third glass, the one with whatever Vincent had placed in it, was still on her tray. She had set the tray on the table 30 seconds ago. She looked at the tray. Alessandro looked at the tray. "Don't touch it," he said immediately to the room in general. Then to Ferretti, "Get something to secure that." Ferretti moved. Alessandro looked back at Hazel. In his eyes was the specific layered look of a man who is running several calculations simultaneously and who has just received a result that changes the output of all of them at once. "You understand," he said slowly, "what you just did tonight." "I understand some of it," she said honestly. "Russo had enough support in this room to make my position complicated if I died tonight the way he planned. The men at this table would have fractured, half to Russo's successor, half to chaos. The war that's been building for 18 months would have ignited tonight." He paused. Instead, the man who planned it died at his own table in front of his own allies, with evidence of the plot in the glass beside him. She absorbed this. "You didn't just save my life," he said. "You ended a war before it started." She looked at him. She was acutely, almost painfully aware that this conversation was happening in front of 7 men who were processing it in real time, who were filing every word of it in the internal archives that men like this kept, who would remember this moment and what it meant for a very long time. She was also acutely aware that she was a 28-year-old plus-sized black woman from the south side of Chicago in a polyester uniform, sitting at a table with the head of the most powerful criminal organization in the city, and that the world had just in the space of 45 minutes rearranged itself around her in a way she did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. She said the only thing that felt true, "I just didn't want to watch someone die." Alessandro Vitiello looked at her for a long time after that, and then very quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it, he said, "Neither did I, 6 years ago, in Memphis." Her throat tightened. Outside the locked dining room of Castello Nero, Chicago, continued its normal September evening. Traffic on Wacker Drive. The elevated train on the loop. Millions of people living their lives in the ordinary, uncomplicated way that people live when they are not in rooms where history is being made. Inside, Hazel Jenkins sat at a table with a Mafia boss who remembered her face and understood with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water that whatever her life had been before 9:14 this evening, it was not going to be that anymore. The only question that remained was what it was going to be instead. And that question was answered 40 seconds later when Ferretti returned from the corridor and leaned down to say something low and urgent into Alessandro's ear. And Alessandro's expression changed in a way she had not seen it change all evening, a new tension, a different calculation. And he straightened and looked at the room and said clearly and with the finality of a man delivering an ending, "The bartender talked. The order didn't come from Russo's office." He let the pause breathe. Let it fill the room. Let every man at the table understand what was coming before it arrived. It came from inside this table. 7 men, 7 faces, 6 showing the shock of the genuinely surprised, 1 showing the very specific, very brief flash of something else entirely. Alessandro saw it. Hazel saw it too. And in that moment, sitting at a table she had never been supposed to sit at, in a world she had never been supposed to inhabit, Hazel Jenkins understood that the evening was nowhere near over. The name came from Vincent, in under 4 minutes. Hazel learned this not because anyone told her directly, but because she had been sitting at that table long enough to understand how information moved through a room full of men who dealt in it professionally. Ferretti came back through the service corridor door at 9:47, and he bent close to Alessandro's ear, and whatever he said took 11 seconds. And when he straightened back up, Alessandro did not look at Ferretti. He looked at the table. Specifically, he looked at the man sitting third from the left, a heavy-set man in his early 60s named Carmine Battaglia, who had been at every dinner Hazel had ever served in this room, who always ordered the branzino, who tipped exactly 18% every single time without variation, and who was currently displaying the very specific, very controlled expression of a man who had just realized that the 11 seconds of Ferretti's whisper had been about him. Alessandro said nothing for a long moment. The silence at that table was the most dangerous silence Hazel had ever sat inside. It had texture. It had temperature. It pressed against the skin the way cold water presses when you step into it too fast, and every man at that table felt it, and every man at that table understood what it meant, except for the one man who was pretending he didn't. Battaglia picked up his water glass, set it back down, picked up his fork, set it back down. "Carmine," Alessandro said. Battaglia looked up. His face was doing an impressive job. Hazel would give him that. 63 years of practice in rooms like this had given him a face that could produce confusion and mild concern on demand, and he was producing both now with professional fluency. "Something wrong, Alessandro. You tell me." Another pause. Battaglia's eyes moved briefly to the space near the service corridor where Vincent had last been visible before Ferretti had escorted him through. The movement was small. It was fast. It was the involuntary, panicked eye movement of a man checking whether the source of his problem was still in the room. Alessandro watched him check. Hazel watched Alessandro watch him check. "I don't know what you're referring to," Battaglia said. His voice was steady. Good, but not as good as it had been 30 seconds ago. Alessandro leaned back in his chair. This was the gesture Hazel had catalogued earlier in the evening, the lean of a man establishing his position in a room without raising his voice, and up close with the full knowledge of what was happening beneath it. The gesture was devastating. "Vincent says the call to Russo's office came through a relay, prepaid, purchased 3 weeks ago in Evanston." He paused. "Your daughter lives in Evanston, doesn't she, Carmine?" The table went absolutely rigid. Batalia's face did the thing that faces do when the internal machinery stops responding to conscious instruction. It did not collapse entirely. He was too experienced for full collapse, but it shifted, fractured along the lines that Alessandro's precision had just located. And what came through those fractures was not guilt exactly. It was the particular hollow expression of a man who has been caught not in the act but in the architecture, the planning, the weeks of careful construction, and who understands that the building has just come down on top of him. "I want to be very clear," Battaglia said, and his voice had changed, the steadiness replaced by something that was working too hard at steadiness and therefore was not steady at all, "that I had nothing to do with—" "Stop!" Alessandro's voice did not rise. It never rose. But it cut through Battaglia's sentence as cleanly as a blade through water, and Battaglia stopped. "Don't do that. Don't sit at this table and do that. You've been here too long for that." A long, terrible silence. Then Battaglia put his fork down. He put both hands flat on the table. He straightened his spine. And something shifted in his face, not to honesty exactly, but to something adjacent to it, something that recognized that performance had become structurally impossible, and that the only remaining option was a different kind of strategy. "Russo approached me 14 months ago," he said. His voice was flat now, stripped of texture, the voice of a man giving a deposition. He had numbers, projections. He made an argument that the transition of power was going to cost us all significantly in the short term, and that a different transition would be more stable for everyone. "Everyone," Alessandro repeated, "for the organization." "You mean for Russo?" Battaglia's jaw tightened. "I was protecting my position." "By killing mine." The word killing sat in the air above the table. Nobody moved around it. Nobody reached to soften it or redirect it. It sat there in the amber light of the Castello Nero dining room, and it was accurate, and everyone knew it was accurate, and that accuracy made the air almost too thick to breathe. "I have been at this table for 22 years, Battaglia said, and for the first time all evening his voice carried something genuine, something old and tired and almost human. 22 years, and you walk in here at 40 years old and they hand you everything like it's what?" Alessandro said, quietly, "like it was earned because it was Carmine. The same way you earned your 22 years. The same way everyone at this table earned their chair." He paused. "The difference is that none of them tried to poison mine." Battaglia looked at him. The performance was completely gone now. What was left underneath it was just a man. A frightened, exhausted old man who had made a calculation 14 months ago that had seemed reasonable and had ended tonight at 9:47 in the worst possible way. He looked briefly at Hazel. She held his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not soften, and she did not apologize with her eyes for existing in this room in this moment, which was the thing she would have done 2 hours ago before everything, because 2 hours ago she was still the kind of person who apologized for taking up space. "The waitress," Battaglia said, and his voice had shifted again into something colder, something calculating, something reaching for leverage in a room that had none left to offer him. "This is on the word of a waitress. This is on the word of a bartender, a prepaid phone registered through your daughter's zip code, and 14 months of movement records that Ferretti has been compiling since March." Alessandro did not look at Hazel when he said this. He did not need to. Hazel Jenkins was the last piece, not the first. The cold thing in Battaglia's voice went out, like a light switched off. Hazel understood in that moment what Alessandro had just done. He had protected her, not overtly, not with a declaration, but structurally by establishing that she was the final confirmation of something already built, not the foundation of an accusation that could be dismantled by discrediting her. He had taken her out of the line of fire with 4 sentences and made it look like information management. She stored this. She filed it next to Memphis, and next to the 2 words, and next to the look on his face when she had told him why she had changed the glass. Ferretti stepped forward. He said one word to Battaglia, a quiet word. The word was simply, "Come." And Battaglia stood. He was 63 years old, and he had run the West Side operation for 2 decades, and he stood up from that table with more dignity than Hazel expected, straightening his jacket, touching his tie. Once looking around the table at the men he had sat beside for the better part of his adult life, none of them looked back at him. He walked out through the service corridor at 9:52 in the evening. The room breathed. Alessandro sat in the resulting silence for almost 30 seconds, long enough that the remaining 5 men at the table had time to understand that the silence was intentional, that it was a space being created deliberately for a specific purpose. Then he said, "Anyone else at this table has something they'd like to tell me. Now is the time." Nobody spoke. "Good," he said. "Then we're going to talk about what comes next." What came next was 40 minutes of conversation that Hazel was not part of and was not supposed to be part of, and she understood this, and she stood from the table when Alessandro indicated a small, clean movement of his hand, and she returned to the service corridor, and she stood there and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with the detached, observational quality that extreme stress sometimes produced the ability to look at your own physical responses as if they belonged to someone else, someone interesting. Someone you were watching from a slight distance. Her hands were shaking, and her left palm ached where the glass had cut it, and her legs, which had been performing normally for the last 3 hours through some combination of adrenaline and stubbornness, were now communicating their true feelings about the evening. She sat down on the floor of the service corridor, back against the wall, uniform still perfectly buttoned, name tag still perfectly level, and she sat there for exactly the amount of time her legs needed before they were willing to be reliable again. Darius found her at 10:23. He came from the far end of the corridor, moving carefully the way people move when they're not sure what they're going to find. When he saw her sitting on the floor, his face arranged itself into the expression of someone who is trying to decide between 3 different responses and landing somewhere between all of them. "Are you okay?" he said. "I'm sitting on the floor of a service corridor," she said. "Yeah, I see that." He crouched beside her. He was 22 and studying criminology, and he had just spent the last hour in the staff room with 2 of Alessandro's men, who had asked him a series of questions he had answered as honestly as his 22 years of self-preservation instinct would allow. "They let me come back. They said the kitchen staff can go. Chef Marco's already gone." He paused. "Caruso's having some kind of episode in the office. One of the guys is with him." "Caruso will be fine," she said. "He always lands on the correct side of things. It's his one consistent quality." Darius almost smiled. Almost. "Hazel, what happened tonight?" She looked at him. He deserved something. He was 22, and he'd been dropped into this without preparation, and he'd handled it with more composure than most people twice his age would have managed. "A man tried to kill another man," she said, "and it didn't work. Because of you. Because of several things." "Hazel, Darius," she looked at him steadily. "Go home. Study your criminology. Don't talk about tonight with anyone. Not your roommate, not your mother, not your professor." She paused. "Especially not your professor." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" She considered this question with genuine attention, which was more than the question usually received from her. "I think so," she said. "I genuinely don't know what okay looks like from here, but I think so." He nodded. He stood up. He looked at her one more time, a young man's look open, and a little frightened and trying hard not to be, and then he walked to the far end of the corridor and was gone. She got back on her feet at 10:31. She went to the sink in the corridor, ran cold water over her left palm, pressed a clean cloth against it. The cut was minor. It looked dramatic the way minor cuts on hands always look dramatic, but it was minor. She held the cloth in place for 90 seconds, and then removed it and flexed her fingers, and they worked fine. She straightened her uniform. She went back into the dining room. The 5 remaining men at the long table were in conversation, a conversation that quieted by several degrees when she entered. Alessandro was still at the head. He looked at her when she came in with the same directness he'd been applying to her all evening, and she had the strange, destabilizing sensation that this was simply going to be something she would have to get used to, being looked at, being seen, by him specifically. "You should eat something," he said. Of all the things she had been preparing for him to say, this was not among them. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I said." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The 5 men at the table were having a sudden collective interest in their water glasses. "Kitchen's closed," she said. "Chef Marco left bread and cold cuts in the prep area before he left." Ferretti checked. He said this in the same tone he used for everything level precise without decoration. "You've been on your feet since 6. You carried a tray through the most dangerous moment in this room in 20 years. You should eat something." She stood there for a moment. The situation was so far outside any category she had a ready response for that her brain cycled through several options and discarded all of them. She went to the kitchen prep area. She found the bread and the cold cuts. She made herself a sandwich standing at the prep counter, eating it in 4 minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who has remembered that their body exists and requires maintenance. It was the best sandwich she'd ever eaten, which probably said something about adrenaline and relative hunger levels. She came back out at 10:44. The configuration of the room had changed. The 5 men at the table were now 3, and those 3 were in low conversation with each other that had the quality of conversation among people who are processing something significant and doing it collectively, because the alternative is doing it alone, which is worse. Ferretti was near the elevator, and Alessandro was standing at the bar. Not drinking, just standing there, looking at the bar surface the way you look at something when you're not actually looking at it, when your eyes need somewhere to rest while your mind is somewhere else entirely. She crossed the room and stood beside him. Not close. 3 feet of space between them, the professional distance she had maintained for 3 years, which felt both entirely appropriate and entirely absurd given the last 4 hours. He didn't look at her when she arrived. He kept looking at the bar surface. But he said Russo's successor will make a move within 72 hours, probably less. "I know," she said. He looked at her then, a flicker of something not quite surprise but adjacent. 3 years in this room," she said simply. He nodded slowly. "The organization is going to fracture along the line between Russo's people and mine. There are 7 locations in the city where that fracture will express itself first." He paused. "I have 48 hours to make 48 decisions correctly." She wasn't entirely sure why he was telling her this. She filed the uncertainty alongside everything else. "What I'm less certain about," he continued, and his voice changed, shifted down. A register became something less operational and more private, "is what to do about you." "I go home," she said. "I come back for my next shift. If there is a next shift." "There is." He said it without hesitation. "But that's not what I mean." The 3 men at the table were not looking at them. They were trying very hard not to look at them, which meant they were paying close attention. "What do you mean?" she asked. He turned to face her fully, up close with 4 hours of accumulated knowledge of who this man was and how he operated. The full weight of his direct attention was something she had to consciously stabilize herself against. Not because it was threatening, because it wasn't. Because it was the specific weight of being taken seriously by someone who understood the value of the thing they were taking seriously. And she had been a very long time without that particular weight. And her body didn't quite know how to stand under it yet. "You saw what trained people missed," he said. "You moved in a room full of the most dangerous men in this city, and you moved without panic, without error, with a level of precision that most people I employ professionally cannot match." He paused. "And you did it to protect someone you didn't know you knew, on the basis of 2 words 6 years ago in a hotel in Memphis." She held his gaze. "That tells me something about who you are," he said. "It tells you I have a long memory," she said. "It tells me you have the specific kind of courage," he said. "The kind that operates without audience, without reward, without any reasonable expectation of surviving the choice." He paused again. "That's the rarest kind." The room was very quiet. Outside Chicago continued. Inside time had taken on the particular distorted quality it takes when the world is rearranging itself around a moment. "I'm a waitress," she said. Not defensively, not apologetically, just accurately. "You were a waitress," he said. The correction was quiet. Absolute. Final in the way that only simple true things are final. She looked at him. "What does that mean exactly in practical terms?" He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, and in the geography of Alessandro Vitiello's face, almost was significant. "It means you don't go home tonight and come back for your next shift and pretend this evening was a shift." "Then what do I do?" "Tonight you stay. Ferretti has a car outside. There's a residence on the North Shore where my people are secure while the city settles. You stay there until I understand the full shape of what's about to happen." He looked at her steadily. "After that, we have a conversation about what your skills are actually worth in a context designed to use them." She stood very still, processing. The way she always processed completely without rushing, taking the actual dimensions of a thing rather than her initial impression of them. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you something better than a job," he said. "I'm offering you a position. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "A job," he said, "is something you can lose. A position is something you hold. In my world, the distinction matters considerably." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if I say no, if I say I want to go home and come back for my next shift and go back to being invisible?" Something moved through his expression. Not anger, nothing close to anger. Something much older than anger, something that had been in his face all evening in the spaces between his words, and that she was only now identifying clearly. It was the expression of a man who understood loss, who had cataloged it, metabolized it, learned to function alongside it, and who was in this particular moment, very specifically unwilling to add to the catalog. "Then I have a car take you home," he said. "And I double your security detail on the building, and I wait." "Wait for what?" "For you to realize that invisible isn't safety," he said. "It never was. It was just the best option you had at the time." He looked at her with that surgical seeing-through precision. "You have better options now." She stood at the bar of the Castello Nero dining room at 10:59 in the evening, and she thought about her apartment on the third floor of a building on West Fullerton, about the books stacked on her nightstand, and the sister who called every Sunday, and the life that was small and quiet and safe, in the way that small and quiet things are safe, which is only in the absence of other options. She thought about the tray in her hands, and the weight of it, and the moment of the glass exchange, and the specific electric clarity of making a decision under pressure, and the feeling she had never had in 3 years of invisibility, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was capable of doing, at full capacity, without apology. She thought about Memphis. 2 words. The locked drawer that had been open now for 4 hours, and that she understood with complete certainty was never going to close again. She turned to look at the room. The 3 men at the table. Ferretti near the elevator, the empty chair at the head of the table, the outline of where Russo had been the chair still slightly displaced, the white tablecloth still carrying the ghost of disruption. She turned back to Alessandro. "I have a sister," she said. "She calls me every Sunday. That doesn't stop." Something settled in his face. "That doesn't stop." "I have conditions," she said, "more than one." "Tell me your conditions," he said, and the almost smile returned, and this time it made it slightly further toward actual. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I'm too tired to negotiate well, and I have a feeling you know that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Fair." She nodded. She looked down at her name tag, the small brass rectangle with Hazel in capital letters that she had pinned to her uniform at 5:45 that evening in the changing room in the life she had been living before 9:14, changed everything. She reached up and unpinned it, held it in her palm for a moment, the metal warm from hours against her chest. She set it on the bar. She looked at Alessandro Vitiello, and he looked back at her, and in the space between them was the specific charged silence of 2 people who have survived something together and who understand without needing to say it that the surviving has bound them in ways that neither of them fully has language for yet. "All right," she said. Just that. 1 word. It was enough. From across the room, Ferretti straightened and moved toward the elevator. The 3 men at the table stood understanding without instruction that the evening's final arrangement had been reached. The mechanisms of Alessandro's world, efficient and practiced, began organizing themselves around the new configuration. And Hazel Jenkins stood at the bar of the Castello Nero and felt for the first time in a very long time the sensation of being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, not because someone had put her there, but because every choice she had ever made, every room she had been invisible in, every tray she had carried, every whispered conversation she had absorbed, had brought her to this bar, to this evening, to this specific and irreversible yes. The elevator opened. Ferretti held it. She walked toward it, and she was not invisible, and she did not look at the floor. The car was a black Escalade with tinted windows and a driver who did not speak, which Hazel appreciated more than she would have been able to explain to anyone who had not just spent 5 hours in a room full of men who never stopped talking underneath their silence. Ferretti sat in the front. She sat in the back. The city moved past the windows at 11:17 in the evening. Chicago doing what Chicago always did, existing loudly, indifferently, with the specific energy of a city that does not pause for individual catastrophes, because individual catastrophes are simply part of its operating rhythm. She watched the lights. Her phone had 4 missed calls, 3 from her sister Renee, 1 from a number she didn't recognize. She stared at Renee's name on the screen for a long moment. Renee called on Sundays. Tonight was Thursday. 3 missed calls on a Thursday night from Renee meant Renee had felt something, the way she always felt things. Renee had a specific, infuriating, completely reliable antenna for when Hazel was in a situation that required sisterly intervention. And apparently that antenna had been active tonight. She texted, "I'm okay, call you tomorrow, don't worry." She put the phone face down on the seat beside her. She did not sleep. She was not capable of sleep. Her brain was running at a speed that sleep could not interrupt, processing, cataloging, filing, building the architecture of what tonight meant in terms she could actually use going forward. This was how she had always handled things that were too large to process emotionally in real time. She turned them into information. She organized the information. She worked with the organization until the emotional component arrived at a manageable size. The residence on the North Shore was not what she expected, which meant she had been expecting something, which meant she had formed assumptions about what Alessandro Vitiello's world looked like up close, and those assumptions were already proving unreliable. It was large, she could tell that from the outside, the scale of the property evident even in the dark, but it was not the kind of large that announced itself. No gates with ornamental ironwork, no guards visible at the entrance. The security was there, she could identify. It had enough experience reading rooms to read exteriors the same way. But it was the kind of security that operated through invisibility, and she recognized the methodology intimately. She almost said something about that, about the irony. She kept it to herself. Ferretti showed her to a room on the 2nd floor. Clean, quiet, well-furnished in the particular way of rooms that are maintained for use rather than display. He showed her the bathroom, showed her where extra linens were stored, told her breakfast would be available at 7 if she wanted it, and then he paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, and his voice had dropped to something that was no longer operational, no longer the voice of Alessandro's right hand performing a function, but simply the voice of a man in his 40s, who had seen a great deal and was occasionally privately moved by things. "What you did tonight. I've been in this work for 18 years. I've never seen anything like it." She looked at him. "You've never seen someone switch a glass before." "I've never seen someone switch a glass for a reason like that," he said. "Most people in your position would have walked past, would have told themselves it wasn't their problem, would have gone home and never thought about it again." "Most people," she said carefully, "haven't been invisible long enough to know what it costs." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once, the nod of a man who understood something he hadn't expected to understand, and he pulled the door closed behind him. She sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet, in the way that well-built rooms are quiet, substantively, completely, with the acoustic density of walls that were designed to hold sound in rather than let it out. She sat in that quiet and let the evening move through her in the order it needed to move, not the order she would have chosen. The wrist, Russo's hand on her wrist, the ring cutting in the force of it. The laughter. She let herself feel that one fully, which she had not been able to do in the room, because feeling it in the room would have been a liability. She felt it now, the specific, deep, old anger that came from being treated like something that did not have the right to take up space, and under the anger, the older thing, the thing that had been underneath all of it for as long as she could remember. The exhaustion of spending a life making herself small enough that other people found her acceptable. She sat with that for a few minutes. Then she thought about the glass in her hands, the weight of it on the tray, the 1.5 seconds of the stumble, the precision of the exchange, the absolute clarity of the moment, the feeling of knowing exactly what she was doing and why. She thought about Alessandro's face when he understood what she had done. Not the cold operational face he wore for the room, the other face, the one underneath, the one that had said Memphis before she had been ready for it. She lay back on the bed at 11:58 and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. She was asleep by 12:43. She woke at 6:17 to the sound of voices somewhere below her. Not alarming voices, the voices of people conducting business moving through the rhythms of a morning that had operational requirements. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of where she was and how she felt about it, and then she got up. She had no change of clothes. She had her uniform, which she was not putting back on, and she had the undershirt she'd worn beneath it. She found in the room's closet a folded shirt that was clearly men's oversized dark blue, and she put it on over her work pants and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 3 seconds and decided that this was acceptable. She went downstairs at 6:41. The kitchen was occupied by a woman she hadn't seen before, 60s efficient, who looked at Hazel's outfit without expression and put a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked. Hazel liked her immediately. "Eggs," the woman said. "Please," Hazel said. She was finishing her eggs at 7:22 when Alessandro came in. He was in different clothes than the night before, dark shirt, no jacket, and he was carrying a phone in mid-sentence on a call, and he moved through the kitchen with the focused energy of someone who had been awake for some time and whose morning had already contained several significant things. He poured himself coffee without looking at it, crossed to the table, registered Hazel, and finished his call in under 30 seconds with 3 decisive sentences that she processed automatically and stored. He sat down across from her. "You slept," he said. "Some," she said. "Good." He looked at her. The morning version of his directness was slightly different from the night version, still precise, still complete, but without the layer of operational management that the dining room had required. This was closer to the face she'd seen in the brief moments at the bar when the room had temporarily receded. "How are you?" She considered giving him the reflexive fine that 28 years of being a woman in professional service had made her default response to that question. She discarded it. "Processing," she said. He nodded, like that was the right answer, like he had been expecting something honest and was acknowledging that he'd received it. "Russo's successor made his move at 4 this morning," he said. She set her coffee cup down. "Faster than you expected," she said. "By about 30 hours, he said, "which tells me the plan was already in motion before last night. Russo's death accelerated it rather than triggering it." He looked at his phone, then back at her. 3 locations on the west side. Nobody was hurt. It was a message, not an action. "What kind of message?" "The kind that says we know Russo's plan failed, but we're proceeding anyway. We have enough to move forward without him." He paused. "It's a bluff. A well-constructed one, but a bluff." "How do you know it's a bluff?" He looked at her steadily. "Because Russo was the center of that network. Everything moved through him. Without him, they have momentum but no infrastructure. They can make noise for 72 hours, maybe 96. Then they run out of organized capacity." He paused. "The question is, what I do in those 72 hours. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You're telling me operational details?" "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive quiet, considering quiet. "Because I want to know what you think," he said. "And because you've already demonstrated that your judgment in high-pressure situations is better than several people I pay specifically for their judgment." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her coffee. Then she said, "If they're bluffing, they need you to respond to the bluff. They need you to move resources to the west side to address the 3 locations, which pulls your attention and your people from wherever your actual vulnerability is." He was very still. "So the question," she continued, "isn't what happened on the west side at 4 in the morning. The question is, what didn't happen somewhere else while everyone was looking at the west side?" The silence that followed was different from the Castello Nero silences. Those had been the silences of a room full of dangerous men. This was the silence of one dangerous man encountering a precise and unexpected answer to a question he had been carrying. He picked up his phone. He made a call. 4 sentences direct to whoever answered. He put the phone down. He looked at her. "You're right," he said, simply. without the performance of being impressed, which she respected more than performance would have been. The South Side distribution point. They moved on it an hour ago, quietly. My people didn't flag it because nothing overt happened. Just a shift in personnel. A shift in personnel is the move, she said. Yes. He looked at her with the full weight of it. It is. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. Her heart was doing the measured, elevated thing it had done several times in the last 12 hours, the thing that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific feeling of operating at full capacity in a context that actually required it. Ferretti appeared in the doorway at 7:41, phone in hand, face carrying the specific tension of a man who has news that requires delivery, regardless of the current conversation. "The South Side situation," he said to Alessandro. "I know," Alessandro said. "Handle it the way we discussed in March. Don't move resources from the north. Leave the west side visible, but don't reinforce it." He paused. "And get Mancini on the phone." Ferretti nodded and was gone. Alessandro looked back at Hazel. Something in his expression had shifted again. The operational layer was back, partially the part of him that was always running the larger calculation. But it was running alongside something else now, something that was specific to this table, this morning, this conversation. "You said you had conditions," he said. She had not expected him to return to this so quickly. She had expected more time. She had expected to initiate the conversation herself on her own terms when she felt prepared for it. She recognized sitting at this table in a borrowed shirt with her eggs half-eaten and the morning barely started that Alessandro Vitiello operated on a schedule that did not wait for preparation. She set her cup down. "I do. Tell me." "My sister," she said. "Renee, she's in a 2-bedroom apartment on North Clark. Whatever happens, whatever I'm doing for you, she is completely outside of it. Her name, her address, her life, none of it enters this world. Ever." "Done," he said without hesitation. "I mean it," she said. "I need you to understand that I'm not saying this as a negotiating position. I'm saying it as a line." "I understood you the first time," he said. Not dismissive, precise. The way he handled everything. She held his gaze for a moment, then she continued, "I'm not carrying a gun. I'm not going to. That's not what I do and not what I'm offering you." He nodded. "What are you offering?" "I see things," she said. "I hear things. I read rooms. I've been doing it my whole life, and I've been doing it in your world specifically for 3 years. I know the people at those tables. Not their names necessarily, not their histories, but their patterns. What they do when they're lying. What they do when they're scared. What they do when the deal they're pretending is solid is actually cracking." She paused. "I don't have a title for that. I don't know what you call it in your world." "I call it intelligence," he said. She absorbed this. "Then that's what I'm offering. But I set my own terms for how I do it. I don't report to Ferretti. I don't report to anyone in the chain below you. If I bring you something, I bring it to you directly." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why directly?" "Because information changes when it passes through intermediaries," she said. "Even good ones, even honest ones. The texture changes, the context changes. What I do depends on texture and context." She looked at him steadily. "You understand that. You've been working directly from primary sources your whole career. You know the difference between a report and a room." He looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said. "And I want to know things," she said. "Not everything, not operational details that would put me in a position I can't function in safely. But I don't operate blind. Blind got me 3 years of carrying trays in a room where I could have been useful, and wasn't because I didn't know enough to know when useful was possible." He leaned back slightly in his chair. The specific, deliberate lean she had catalogued the night before, the lean of a man establishing something about power in a room. Except this morning, it was different. This morning it was not a performance. It was just a man in a kitchen chair thinking. "Those are not small conditions," he said. "No," she agreed. "They're not. Most people in this conversation would be asking for money. Most people in this conversation wouldn't have switched the glass," she said. "I'll want to be compensated fairly. That's a separate conversation, and I'll have it without embarrassment. But the conditions I just told you are not about money. They're about how I work." He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I thought about it on the drive here," she said. and for about 40 minutes before I fell asleep, and for approximately the last hour while I was eating eggs and listening to whatever was happening in the next room." He almost smiled. "It made it further this time." "What did you hear in the next room?" "Two men disagreeing about the South Side," she said. "One of them was right, and one of them was managing the one who was right, so he wouldn't feel like he was being overruled. It worked. They came to the right decision. Whoever does that, the managing is good at their job." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's Ferretti." She nodded. "He's the right person for what he does," she said. "That's not what I do." "No," he said. "It's not." He stood from the table. She stood as well. Reflex, the training of 3 years of table service, still operating in her muscle memory, and she caught herself and almost sat back down and then simply stood because standing was fine and the reflex was just a reflex and she did not need to apologize for it. Alessandro extended his hand. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Not a handshake," she said. "That's not how we do this." He raised his eyebrows slightly, the closest thing to open surprise she had seen from him. "In your world," she said, "a handshake at this table means something specific. It means a specific kind of agreement with specific kind of terms, and I am not entering that system through that door." She held his gaze. "We do this differently. We do this like two people who have already been through something together and understand what the other person is made of. That's rarer than a handshake, and it's more binding." He lowered his hand. He looked at her for a long time. And in his face, in the precise and guarded and exhausted and something else face of Alessandro Vitiello at 7:53 on a Friday morning, in a kitchen on the North Shore, she saw the thing she had seen last night when he said Memphis. The thing that was underneath all the architecture of who he had built himself into being. The thing that recognized without plan or intention another person who had built themselves into something out of necessity rather than choice, and who was standing now at the edge of choosing something different. "All right," he said. The same word she had said last night. One word. Enough. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it. Renee. Calling again 7:54 Friday morning because Renee's antenna did not respect business hours. She looked at Alessandro. He looked at the phone. He made a small, clean gesture with his hand, the same gesture she had seen him use at the table last night, the two-finger movement that confirmed and released simultaneously. She picked up the phone. "Renee," she said, "Hazel Marie Jenkins." Renee's voice came through with the particular combination of relief and preemptive indignation that only sisters could produce. "It is 7:54 in the morning, and you texted me, 'I'm okay, don't worry,' at 11 at night, and you think that's sufficient." "I'm okay," Hazel said. "I'm not at home. I'll explain when I can." "You'll explain right now or I'm calling Mama." "Renee." "Don't Renee me. Where are you?" Hazel looked across the kitchen. Alessandro had turned toward the window, giving her the specific privacy of a man who understood that some conversations required the illusion of space, even when space wasn't fully possible. "I'm somewhere safe," she said. "Something happened at work last night. Something significant. I'm not in any danger. I will call you Sunday as usual, and I will tell you what I can tell you." She paused. "You know I always call Sunday." A long pause from Renee. Then quieter, the indignation receding into the thing underneath it. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm sure." "Okay," Renee said. "Okay, but Hazel." "Yeah." "Whatever happened, whatever you did." Another pause. "I know you did the right thing. You always do the right thing. You just never let anyone see you do it." Hazel stood in the kitchen on the North Shore at 7:55 in the morning in a borrowed shirt in the middle of the most consequential 48 hours of her life. And she felt something move through her chest that was too large and too warm and too complicated for her to address in the present moment. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," Renee said, and hung up. Hazel put the phone in her pocket. Alessandro turned back from the window. He read her face the way she had been reading rooms for 3 years, and whatever he saw there, he filed it with the same clean economy she would have used. "She sounds like someone worth protecting," he said. "She's the best person I know," Hazel said simply. He nodded. Then Ferretti appeared in the doorway again, and this time his face had a different quality, The quality of news that could not wait even for a kitchen conversation to conclude. "Mancini's on the line," Ferretti said. "And he's not alone. He's with two of Russo's captains. Says he wants a meeting. Today." He paused. "All three of them walked away from Russo's network this morning. They want to talk terms." Alessandro straightened. The kitchen version of him, the slightly unguarded version, receded by precisely one layer, and the other version came forward, the version that had walked into Castello Nero at 6:17 and sat at the head of a table and said, "Sit down," and made 7 dangerous men comply in under 4 seconds. He looked at Hazel. She looked back at him. "I'll need someone in that room who isn't on anyone's known list," he said. "Someone who can read the table and tell me afterward what they weren't saying." She absorbed this. "Where's the meeting?" "Neutral Ground, a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, private dining room, noon." She thought about the restaurant on Michigan Avenue. She thought about a private dining room at noon with men who had been Russo's until this morning and who were now performing a defection and whose sincerity needed measuring. She thought about what she did and what she was being asked to do and whether those two things were at their core actually different from what she had always done. They weren't. "I'll need different clothes," she said. And just like that, without ceremony, without drama, without any of the language that the movies would have required for a moment like this, Hazel Jenkins stepped fully into the world that had been waiting for her. The clothes arrived at 9:40 in the morning. Not a uniform, not anything that announced a function or a role or a category. A dark blazer, well-cut, the kind that fit across the shoulders the way expensive things fit when someone has actually paid attention to the person they're dressing. Dark trousers, a cream shirt, shoes with enough heel to change how a room registered a person walking into it, but not so much that movement became performance. Hazel held the blazer up and looked at it. Ferretti was in the doorway. "The boss said to tell you the size came from observation, not assumption. If it's wrong, it's right," she said. She dressed in the room on the second floor, and she stood in front of the mirror, and she looked at herself for longer than 3 seconds this time. Longer than she had looked at herself in a very long time, because looking at yourself required a certain kind of willingness to see what was there, and for a long time what was there had been a woman in a uniform that fit wrong, and looking at that had not been a productive use of time or emotional resources. What she saw now was different, not because the clothes were better, though they were, because the person inside them had changed in some fundamental structural way in the last 14 hours, and the change was visible, and she stood there and let herself see it. She went downstairs at 10:15. Alessandro was in the main room with Ferretti and 2 other men she hadn't seen before, the 4 of them arranged around a table covered in documents and phones. He looked up when she walked in. The 2 men she didn't know looked up. The room registered her the way rooms had always registered her, but differently. Not the non-registration of invisibility. The full conscious assessing registration of people encountering someone they needed to evaluate. She let them evaluate. She stood in the doorway, and she did not fill the silence with movement or apology, and she did not look at the floor. Alessandro looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said to the room in general, "Give us 5 minutes." And the 2 men she didn't know were out of the room before the sentence was fully finished, and Ferretti followed with the practiced discretion she had come to recognize as his signature. Alessandro crossed to where she was standing. He stopped 3 feet away. The same professional distance she had maintained in the dining room, except now on this side of everything, it felt chosen rather than imposed, and the difference was considerable. "How are you thinking about this afternoon?" he said. "Tell me who Mancini is," she said. "Not his history, not his file. Tell me who he is." He considered this for a moment, understanding the distinction. 61 years old, ran Russo's financial operations for 14 years. Intelligent, cautious, the kind of man who stays in the back of every photograph because staying in the back of photographs is how he's survived this long. He doesn't make moves without knowing the floor under the move is solid. He paused. He walked away from Russo's network this morning with 2 captains. That means he knew last night that Russo was finished, before the body was cold. He had his own intelligence, she said. Yes, which means he's been watching both sides of this for longer than this morning. He saw the coup coming. He positioned himself to survive whichever outcome happened. She was thinking aloud now, not performing, just processing in the way she processed out loud when the thinking benefited from sound. He's not defecting to you because Russo lost. He's defecting because he already decided you were the better long-term position, and he's been waiting for the right moment to make the move look organic rather than strategic. Alessandra was very still. So the question in that room this afternoon, she said, isn't whether he's sincere. He's sincere the way someone who has already made a calculation is sincere, which is completely because the calculation is done, and sincerity is now the most efficient path. The question is what he knows, what he's carrying, what information he has about Russo's network that he's going to use as currency in that room. And, Alessandro said, and you need to know what that information is worth before you agree to whatever terms he brings, she said. Because if you agree too quickly, you signal that you needed it. And if you know what it is before he offers it, you can receive it without showing what it means to you. The room was very quiet. I need you to find out, he said, what he knows, without asking him directly, without him understanding that's what's being assessed. I know, she said. The two captains who came with him, their names are Vitale and Greco. Vitale is loyal to Mancini, specifically not to any ideology or organization. Greco is more complicated. He's been with Russo's organization for 23 years. A man like that doesn't walk away easily. He needs to believe he's walking towards something, not just away. She absorbed this, filed it. Greco is the one to watch. Yes. What's my role in that room? She said. Officially. He paused. Advisor. With a name, with your name, he said. Hazel Jenkins. No title beyond advisor. In my world, advisor without a defined function reads as more significant than any specific title, because it means you have direct access without portfolio. And direct access without portfolio means the boss trusts your judgment above the system. She looked at him. That's true, isn't it? Not just optics. Yes, he said. It's true. She nodded. Then, and if something happens in that room that requires a decision you haven't anticipated, something that changes the shape of the negotiation, then you do what you did last night, he said. You trust what you see. The drive to Michigan Avenue took 22 minutes. She sat in the back of the Escalade beside Alessandro Ferretti in the front. The city moving past in the particular quality of Friday midday, Chicago dense, purposeful, indifferent. Alessandro was on his phone for most of the drive, 3 separate calls, each one conducted in the low, economical sentences she was beginning to understand as his natural language. No wasted words, no performance. Information moving from one point to another with the minimum necessary friction. She used the 22 minutes to be quiet inside herself, to let everything settle into the positions it needed to occupy for the next 2 hours to go the way they needed to go. This was something she had always known how to do, the interior, settling the clearing of everything irrelevant, but she had never had a context before that required it in this particular way, at this particular level of consequence. She was ready when the car stopped. The restaurant was the kind of Michigan Avenue establishment that operated in the register of serious, rather than impressive good food, served without theater, the kind of place where the staff understood that discretion was as much a part of the service as the food. The private dining room was off a short corridor, separate from the main dining floor. 2 of Alessandro's men were already positioned in the corridor when they arrived, visible deliberate, the positioning of people who were making a point about preparation. Mancini was already in the room. He was 61, and he looked exactly like Alessandro had described him, the kind of man designed by 30 years of survival to occupy the middle of everything. Not the front, not the back. Medium height, medium build, the face of a man who had trained himself out of expressiveness so thoroughly that expressiveness had to work hard to find its way back in. He was standing when they entered, which was either respect or tactics, and probably both. Vitale and Greco were flanking him. Vitale was 50s compact, watching Alessandro with the focused assessment of a man who has transferred his loyalty and is now taking inventory of what he's transferred it to. Greco was older, late 50s, heavier, and his face had something in it that Vitale's did, not a layer of something underneath the controlled exterior that Hazel clocked immediately and filed under watch carefully. Mancini extended his hand to Alessandro. Mr. Vitiello, thank you for the meeting. "Sit down, Carmine," Alessandro said, and the use of the first name casual confident was itself a statement about who held the room. They sat. Alessandro at one end of the table, Mancini at the other, their respective people arranged accordingly. Hazel sat to Alessandro's right, one chair back from the table, close enough to hear everything positioned in the specific way of someone who is present without being principal, which was both accurate and she understood precisely calibrated. Mancini noticed her. His eyes moved to her with the careful, practiced assessment of a man who cataloged everyone in every room automatically. He looked at her long enough to register that he didn't recognize her, and then he moved on, and she watched him move on and noted the specific quality of the dismissal, automatic, unreflective. The dismissal of a man who had spent 61 years in a world where women at these tables were either wives or decorative, and whose categorization machinery had processed her and filed her accordingly without engaging. She let him file her. It was the most useful thing he could have done. The conversation began. Mancini was good. She gave him that without reservation. He was very, very good. He opened with the structure of his offer before Alessandro had to ask for it, which was itself a move establishing himself as someone who leads rather than responds. He laid out what he was bringing, specifics of Russo's network, financial structures, the names and positions of the remaining loyalists who had not walked with him this morning, and who were, he implied, available to be managed if Alessandro chose to manage them. He spoke for 11 minutes. Alessandro listened with the complete architectural attention she had observed all through last night, and he asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one opening a door that Mancini stepped through without realizing the door had been placed there specifically to be stepped through. She watched Greco. Greco was watching the conversation between Alessandro and Mancini with the expression of a man attending a performance he has already seen. Not bored, not uninvested, but carrying the specific quality of someone who knows how this ends and is waiting for the people around him to catch up. His hands were on the table. His right thumb moved in a small, repetitive circle against the tablecloth, which she had seen before, had seen on other men at other tables, and which meant something specific. Not anxiety, not impatience, but the physical expression of a person running a private calculation in parallel with the public conversation. He wasn't fully committed to this room. She understood it with the complete settled certainty of 3 years of reading men in exactly this kind of context, and the certainty landed in her chest with the weight of something that needed action. She reached forward and poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the table. A small movement, an unremarkable movement, the kind of movement that a person in the background makes that nobody at a table like this consciously registers. Greco's eyes moved to her, not with the casual filing assessment that Mancini had used, with something sharper, more alert. The reflex of a man whose instinct for threat had been calibrated over decades, and was currently, for reasons he couldn't articulate, flagging something about the woman in the dark blazer who had just poured herself water. She met his eyes. Not aggressively, not with challenge, with the clean, level, steady gaze of someone who is not hiding anything because they have already decided that hiding is not the right tool for this moment. She held it for exactly 3 seconds, and then she looked back at the table, and in those 3 seconds, she had communicated something that she could not have put into words, but that Greco, whose instinct had been calibrated by decades, received completely. She knew. She didn't know what specifically, but she knew something. And she was telling him she knew, and she was telling him without aggression, without threat, with the specific, careful communication of someone who is offering him the chance to make a different decision than the one his thumb had been calculating against the tablecloth. Greco's thumb stopped moving. At the other end of the table, Mancini had arrived at the terms portion of his proposal. He was laying them out with the precision of a man who had prepared them carefully, and they were reasonable terms, well-constructed terms, the terms of someone who understood the value of what he was offering and had priced it accurately. Alessandro listened. Then he said, "These are your terms as you've outlined them." "Yes," Mancini said. "And the 3 of you are in agreement on these terms, all 3. He looked at Vitale, then at Greco. "All 3, he said again. Vitale said yes. Greco was quiet for exactly 1 second longer than he should have been, 1 second in a room like this, at a table like this, in a conversation with stakes like these, is the length of a confession. Mancini heard it. His head turned toward Greco by a fraction. Greco said, yes. But the 1 second had already happened, and Alessandro had heard it, and Hazel, watching all three of them, understood what she was seeing: a man who had come to this table with divided intentions, who had been running two calculations simultaneously, and who had just in 1 second of silence reached a decision point that he had not expected to reach this quickly. Alessandro looked at Hazel, not publicly, not in a way that announced itself to the room. A brief direct between them look that asked a question. She gave him the smallest possible nod. Just once, the nod of someone who has confirmed a read. He looked back at the table. "Greco," he said, "tell me what you're not telling Mancini." The room stopped. Mancini's face did the thing that Battaglia's face had done the night before, the fracturing the internal machinery, failing to respond to conscious instruction. But Mancini recovered faster than Battaglia because Mancini was better than Battaglia, and what replaced the fracture was rapid, intelligent recalculation rather than collapse. Greco looked at Alessandro for a long moment. Then he looked at Hazel. And his expression when he looked at her was not anger and not suspicion and not the resentment of a man who has been caught. It was something closer to recognition. The expression of someone who has encountered a kind of perception he did not expect to find in this room, at this table, in this particular package, and who has decided that the finding is itself information worth responding to. "Russo had a secondary arrangement," Greco said. His voice was level, final, the voice of a man who has just stepped through a door and pulled it closed behind him. "Outside the organization, federal level." The silence that followed was total. Mancini sat completely still. Whether he had known this or not was impossible to read from his face, and the impossibility was itself information. "An informant arrangement," Alessandro said. "Not him directly. A layer removed. Someone inside his financial operation who was feeding information in exchange for protection, has been for 8 months. Greco's jaw was set. "I found out 4 weeks ago. I didn't tell Mancini because I didn't know whose side Mancini was on. I came to this meeting to find out." He looked at Alessandro. "Now I know," he said. The room held this. All of them held it, processing at their individual speeds, understanding at their individual depths. Mancini, to his credit, said nothing, which was the right thing to say. The intelligent thing, the thing that told Hazel he had not known about the federal arrangement and was now incorporating it into his calculus with the speed of a man who had survived 61 years by being faster than his circumstances. Alessandro was still. Then he said to Greco directly, "The person inside the financial operation, do you have a name?" "I have more than a name," Greco said. "I have 8 months of records." Alessandro looked at Hazel one more time. Her face told him everything he needed to know, which was, "This is real. This is the room telling you the truth." Greco made his decision, and it's genuine, and Mancini is calculating, but he's calculating toward you, not away. Alessandro looked back at the table. "We're going to need more time than I allocated for this meeting," he said. He reached for his phone. "Ferretti." The afternoon took 4 hours. Hazel did not speak again in that room except once at the 2-hour mark, when the conversation had arrived at the structure of what would happen with the federal informant, how to manage it, what it exposed, how to insulate the organization from the exposure. And she said quietly into a brief pause in the conversation, "You're solving the wrong problem." Every head at the table turned to her. She looked at Alessandro. "The informant is already built in. 8 months of information is already transferred. Shutting down the arrangement now doesn't remove the information that exists. It just removes your visibility into what they're asking about." She paused. "You want to know what they know. The only way to know what they know is to keep the arrangement active long enough to understand the scope. Then you address the scope." The table was very quiet. Alessandro said, "You'd need someone inside the financial operation who could manage that, who could keep the arrangement active without triggering alarm while you mapped the exposure." "Yes," she said. "That's a specific and extremely dangerous function." "Yes," she said again. "Do you have someone in mind?" he said. and the way he said it told her that he already knew the answer that he was asking, because the asking was its own kind of confirmation of something they had both been moving toward since 7:53 that morning in the kitchen. She looked at him steadily. "I have someone in mind," she said. She did not say the name out loud. She did not need to. By the time the 4 hours were done, the structure of what came next had been built, not completely, not with all its details resolved, but with the architecture established. The load-bearing elements identified the relationships between the people in that room, defined in ways that would hold. Mancini's terms were modified and agreed to. Greco's information was secured. The federal exposure was mapped and a strategy was in motion. The three men left at 5:44. Hazel and Alessandro sat at the table after they were gone. Ferretti was in the corridor. The private dining room of the restaurant on Michigan Avenue was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after consequential things have happened in them, not empty, but settled, the air still carrying the weight of what had moved through it. Alessandro looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "You told Greco you knew something, without words, across the table, from a pour of water." "Yes," she said. "How long have you been able to do that?" She thought about it. "I've been doing it my whole life," she said. "I just never had a room that needed it done." He was quiet. Then he said, "The federal situation. What you proposed in there. It puts you at the center of something that has no protection if it goes wrong." "I know," she said. "You said yes anyway." "I said I had someone in mind," she said. "I didn't say yes yet. That's a different conversation." He looked at her. "When do you want to have it?" She considered. Outside Michigan Avenue was doing its Friday late afternoon, the city gathering itself for the end of the week, people moving with the specific energy of people who are almost done with something, who can see the finish line of the ordinary close enough to feel it. She thought about Renee calling on Sunday. She thought about the apartment on West Fullerton, the books on the nightstand, the small and quiet life that had been safe in the way that the absence of options feels like safety until something better arrives. She thought about the tray in her hands at 9:14 the previous evening, the weight of it, the 1.5 seconds, the feeling of knowing exactly what she was doing and why. She said, "I want 24 hours. Not to decide. I've already decided. To understand exactly what I'm deciding fully from every angle before I commit to it out loud. Because once I commit to it out loud, I don't go back on it." He looked at her. "I know," he said simply. She nodded. She stood from the table. He stood with her. Ferretti materialized in the doorway as if the standing had been a signal, which perhaps it had. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her, straight, settled, present. Then she stopped and looked back at Alessandro. "Last night," she said, "when Russo said what he said, at the beginning, before everything else." He knew what she was referring to. She could see it in his face. "You heard that," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you didn't do anything in that moment. You couldn't room the situation. I understand why." She held his gaze. "But I want you to know that what I did later had nothing to do with that. The glass. That wasn't about what he said to me. That was about who you were in Memphis." He was very still. "I want to be clear about that," she said, "because I need you to understand from the beginning that what I bring to your world isn't gratitude and it isn't debt. It's judgment. My own judgment, on my own terms." She looked at him steadily. "I chose Memphis before I chose the glass. The glass came after. That order matters." He looked at her for a long time, and in his face she saw the things she had been seeing in pieces all through the last 20 hours, in the bar at Castello Nero, in the kitchen on the North Shore, across the table from Mancini and Greco. The complete, undivided, rare thing of being genuinely understood by someone who had the capacity to understand and the honesty to show it. "I know the order," he said quietly. "I've known it since the glass." She held his gaze one more time. Then she turned and walked toward the corridor, and Ferretti fell in beside her, and the door to the private dining room of the restaurant on Michigan Avenue closed behind her. In the car on the way back, she looked at her own hands resting in her lap, the left palm, the thin line of the cut, almost invisible now. Her hands, which had carried trays for 3 years in a room full of men who never once looked at her face. Her hands, which had held a glass in the right place at the right moment and changed the shape of everything. She thought about all the rooms she had been invisible in, all the tables she had cleared, all the conversations she had absorbed without anyone knowing she was absorbing them. She thought about the specific, long, patient accumulation of it, the years of being filed and dismissed and stepped over and looked through, and she understood something she had not had language for before. All of it had been preparation, not for someone else's story, for hers. She was not a waitress who had stumbled into a dangerous world. She was a woman who had spent 28 years building exactly the skills, exactly the precision, exactly the quality of perception and nerve and stillness that this particular moment in this particular world required, and she had built them in the only classroom that had been available to her, which was invisibility, which was being overlooked, which was carrying trays through rooms where no one knew her name. Dominic Russo had called her invisible. He had meant it as an ending. It had been all along the beginning. The car moved through Chicago in the last light of a Friday afternoon, and Hazel Jenkins sat in the back seat and looked at her hands, and she was not invisible, and she was not afraid, and she was not done. She was for the first time in her life exactly as dangerous as she had always been capable of being, and the most powerful man in Chicago knew her name.